Good morning, everyone. Okay, so we are in week number 3 of our sermon series that is entitled Conversations with Jesus, Encountering the Love of Christ. And week to week, we're going to be exploring various conversations that Jesus had with people that he met in his ministry. And the hope is that as we continue to lean into ways that Jesus built relationship, our conversations will be deeper and meaningful and transformational. And then this is because I want you to remember this buzz phrase, because transformation happens at the speed of relationships. Very good. Okay. So we want to pay attention in the weeks to come about how to foster and nurture good, healthy relationships that go beyond, you doing okay? To knowing how to invite conversations that look inward, where we house our pain and our feelings, our hidden self. So far, we've learned about being curious and not to make assumptions by mind reading. And today, our focus is to remain teachable through humbleness, to listen deeply to one another and to Jesus. And who better to teach us than Jesus himself? So this morning we're going to be looking at a passage that can be disturbing a little bit in how Jesus is portrayed. It's an uncomfortable passage because it is the opposite of the usual narrative where we find Jesus correcting or teaching others based upon an event or a question that provokes Jesus's attention. Instead, we find Jesus right off the bat withdrawing and wanting to distance himself from the Pharisees. He's just come off of condemning their ritualistic ways and traditions in earlier passages of Matthew. He has now entered Gentile territory. And in case you're wondering, a Gentile is a person who's not Jewish, and the term can designate a person who is a non-Christian, a pagan, or a person who doesn't belong to a specific religious group. The Gentile territory offers Jesus some retreat time after he's been busy feeding the 5,000 to prove he could meet the needs of the people, walking on water to teach the disciples about faith, challenging the elders for imposing their ways and teachings on others and not God's ways, and having suffered the loss of his dear friend and brother, John the Baptist, who was put to death. And while all this is happening, there's increased opposition to Jesus, and that was growing and gaining momentum. And part of his mission is to raise up the disciples, to spread the gospel with and for him. So he must have been tired, right? It's hard to believe that Jesus would get tired, but remember, Jesus is divine, but also fully human. He's perfect, but he functions like the human body functions. Bodies get tired physically, emotionally, mentally. So as Jesus withdraws, an unknown woman comes out from that same region, and it's safe to say that she's disrupting his plans for rest. So read along with me in Matthew 15, verses 21 through 28. Leaving that place, Jesus withdrew to the region of Tyre and Sidon. A Canaanite woman from that vicinity came to him, crying out, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me. My daughter is demon-possessed and suffering terribly." Jesus did not answer a word. So his disciples came to him and urged him, "Send her away, for she keeps crying out after us." He answered, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel." The woman came and knelt before him. "Lord, help me," she said. He replied, "It is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs." "Yes, it is, Lord," she said. "Even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." Then Jesus said to her, "Woman, you have great faith. Your request is granted." And her daughter was healed at that moment. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So at first glance, this story is about Jesus performing yet another miracle, right, to cast out a demon from a little girl. And some of you may know that in Mark, he talks about the same incidents, Mark 7:24 through 30. And he tells the same story, but the focus is on different audiences. So just briefly to tell you that Matthew describes this woman by her ethnicity and her geographical location as a Canaanite, meaning she was a descendant of Canaan and therefore considered a despised enemy of Israel in biblical history. And Mark, on the other hand, is speaking to the Greek and Roman audience, categorizing this woman by her race as a Syrophoenician woman, a Greek person in the Syria province. Okay, so I'm going to keep just referring to her as a Canaanite woman or the woman in this passage. In any event, we choose to teach, right, from Matthew because it reveals Jesus's humility to listen deeply, inviting relationship. As Jesus models remaining teachable, here he teaches us what that looks like. An absolute must in remaining teachable is living into humility to listen deeply, inviting relationship. And I think that's on your notes. There's a sentence that says humility to listen deeply invites relationship. How do we become humble enough to listen deeply, enough to learn? Jesus and this courageous woman of faith teach us that, number one, it's about people. Anyone can teach us if we let them reach us. Okay, remember that phrase, anyone can teach us if we let them reach us. There are all kinds of obstructions we face between different groups of people and communities, whether it's ethnic or cultural or political or economic or religious. The same hurdles existed then. But Jesus is all about seeing and responding to those on the margins. And this Gentile woman is that in the eyes of the Israelites. She is seen as a part of the population of cursed people with no ability to reach anything higher than the social status of a slave. Her people have been dispossessed by Israel's occupation and possession of their land, and the Israelites do not feel any remorse because Israel's victory was viewed as God's gift, signifying their eliteness and their fact that they were the elect. And this woman dares to challenge their elect status by contending for inclusion because of Jesus and who he is. She calls him Lord, Son of David, and boldly asks for his blessing. Have mercy on me. Do these words sound familiar to you? These are the same words uttered by Bartimaeus when Pastor Rebecca preached about him last week. And he called out to Jesus for healing. And to call Jesus Lord and Son of David meant they identify him as the Messiah. It's an open declaration of their faith. We don't know this woman by name, whether she's single, married, widowed, but we do know she has a daughter who's really sick, and she is willing to risk everything to ask Jesus to heal her. Those of you familiar with the book of Matthew know that going forward in Matthew, in chapter 28, verses 19 through 20, Jesus unveils the Great Commission to make disciples out of all nations. So the discovery here is that this woman is really ahead of her time. And this incident is a prelude to Jesus' formal declaration of the Great Commission. This woman claims that all who believe and have faith in God are included in God's kingdom and therefore recipients of his grace and his blessing. This is startling to Jesus, to Jesus' disciples. At the very least, for they are closed off and they are slower to learn. It's probably really offensive to them what she's doing. How dare she? But for Jesus, who's open to being teachable, it's insightful and probably delightful to some degree as the conversation unfolds. She has insight into the kingdom that none of the disciples could even fathom. Anyone can teach us if... Okay. One more time. That's so sad. Anyone can teach us if we let them reach us. So there's a man, this is real life, a man named John Cox, who is CEO of this Rome group. I think it's a consulting firm. But he shared this great true story about when he was a young consultant working at another firm. And he had this manager who kept a piece of white paper folded up in his pocket. So every now and then he would remove that piece of paper and he would glance at it. And then he would put it back in his pocket. And one day John asked him, "What's on that paper that you always take off?" And the manager showed it to him. And on the paper was written, "Maybe they are right." And he said he carried it with him to remind him that whether it was the janitor, a stranger, a client, or a top executive, he would remain open to learning. To this day, John carries a sheet of paper in his pocket with the same message. So in your bulletin, you all have an index card, you'll see. And I want you to take a moment now to write out the sentence, "Maybe they are right." So just scribble that down. Maybe they are right. And tuck it in your pocket or your wallet or your purse or phone case as a reminder to you to remain teachable, even in the most unlikely circumstances and from the most unlikely people. Because you never know what you might learn. It's always about people over programs, people over protocol. So as Jesus models teachability, he also shows us what it means when we exercise humility to listen deeply in our posture. This is number 2 in your notes. It's about posture. Stop talking. Start listening with discernment. You don't always need to have the last word. Just cover your mouth and practice focused, present listening. Jesus literally stopped talking when this woman first called him Lord, Son of God. He already knew what she was going to ask, but what do you make of his response to this woman? Anyone have thoughts? Like, what did you think of the way he responded to her? Did anyone think it was?
It doesn't sound humble.
It doesn't sound humble. Thanks, Daisy. Anyone else? Like, if you heard this or read this?
It feels unkind.
Very unkind, yeah. Anyone else? Sorry? Dismissive. Okay.
Like a hard boundary.
A hard boundary, yes. All of those things are.
He was irritated and he was tired and he didn't want to hear anybody. Like,
Yeah.
he needed rest.
Yes. So, yes. There's all of that. You guys are all right that those are assumptions we can make, right? So this first time he didn't say anything, and then he indirectly tells her he's not there for her when he's talking really to the disciples and saying, "I'm here, but for the lost sheep of Israel." And then he makes this comment about likening this woman to a dog, right? And so it is all of those things: dismissive, drawing hard boundaries, probably was grumpy, tired Jesus, right? He had an agenda. He had an agenda to go away from the crowds, and this woman, she ambushes him basically, right? And she's saying, "Help me." And Jesus responds to her with silence, but comments to the disciples about his mission being focused on the people of Israel. And I wonder, could that be Jesus listening by being quiet and thinking? Was Jesus wanting to see how teachable the disciples were when put into this challenging situation? By being a reluctant responder, was he hoping for a certain outcome from the disciples other than annoyance and telling Jesus to get rid of her, or maybe just hurry up and heal her and then she'll go away? They make assumptions that Jesus' silence is rejection, when he actually seems to be pausing, discerning, and taking in what is happening with this woman who has clearly sought him out. So don't you wish we could practice Pastor Rebecca's lesson from last week and ask Jesus if we could read his mind, right? The disciples are making all kinds of assumptions without asking or checking with Jesus. But guess who is also listening to Jesus in this? The woman. Who said the woman? Yes, the Canaanite woman. This idea of Israel's temporal priority, meaning that God's redemptive plan prioritized salvation first for the Jews before the rest of the world, was reflected in the statement that Jesus directed to the disciples. I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. But his emphasis on the lost sheep in Israel is actually a reiteration of the same statement that he had made earlier in chapters of Matthew, chapter 10:6, directly to the disciples to focus on spreading the gospel to the people of Israel. Jesus is clear of Israel's priority as part of God's faithfulness to his covenant purposes. But this woman is challenging Israel's exclusivity and saying, what about those of us who believe and worship you, Son of David, the Messiah, our God? She's asking him to consider, doesn't Jesus' mission include us? And as you listen to this conversation, the foreshadowing of a time when Gentiles will be treated equally as Jews on the basis of their faith is taking place. She is persistent in her plea. And here's where we're a little shocked when she says again, Lord, help me. She's telling him, see me not as an outcast, as a Canaanite, but as a person. Now she has his attention, but then Jesus makes a stranger comment. It's not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. Did Jesus just insinuate that she, a Gentile, is a dog? It doesn't seem to bother the woman because she responds, yes, it is, Lord. You can feed the dogs too, she says. Even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table. I think she just rebutted Jesus. I'd call her a baddie in today's world. She was bold and courageous, but still had this measure of humility. She wasn't yelling it. She was simply stating it. This woman knows her status in the social hierarchy. It's still hard to wrap our heads, though, around the fact that Jesus was referring to a person as a dog because she was a Gentile. So here's where the linguistics helps. During that time period, non-Jews or Gentiles were considered unspiritual, and therefore being in the presence of one could make a Jewish person ceremonially unclean. Dogs, expressed in using the Greek word kuon, K-U-O-N, were considered wild animals, unclean and unspiritual. Sparky, close your ears. And then we have two dogs. They're not talking about you. Okay? But in the Greek translation, in this passage, Jesus used the word kunarion, K-U-N-A-R-I-O-N, which translates to small dog or pet dog, which is completely different from the word kuon. An interesting fact, which I'm sure Jesus was aware of based on his use of this word kunarion, is that Jewish people typically did not have dogs as household pets, but Gentiles did. His word choice is contextualized for the Gentile household. So he is not referring to them when he says this as unclean or unspiritual, but instead emphasizing the priority that people are given within his ministry context. Therefore, kunarion, which would mean this woman, were not at the table with people. This woman, though, she's quick and she's bright, responding that pet dogs can still eat the scraps, right? The leftovers that fall from the table. And she is willing to receive anything that Jesus wants to give to her. Her petition to Jesus is that she can expect that she's going to be fed, even if it's crumbs or leftovers, because she belongs with his family of followers. She reminds him and she reminds the disciples that there's more to his mission than the people of Israel. There are the unseen and the forgotten, waiting for the crumbs. While Jesus framed this metaphorical example to more of an either or, right? This woman is saying it's not about whether there's food for one or the other, but ultimately it's about food for everyone, for both. She wants a place at the table, even if it's under it. And that's exactly what Jesus wants, for us to desire to be with him and be open to being fed, whatever that looks like. That is the aha moment. Jesus understands the depths of her faith in him. Her daughter then is healed, right? She doesn't have to go home. She's healed instantly. Her faith elevates her to a place at the table. Granted, sometimes the lessons aren't immediate. You might walk away thinking you missed something, but that's why the best way to process and go deeper is to ask yourself questions. And I've listed several in your bulletin that you can use while in a teachable moment or even afterwards when you've left something that happens and you just feel that there's something Jesus wanted you to know, to teach you, right? Especially when you've come off of a very hard situation. So I'm going to share the story with you, which I actually shared in 2019 in a sermon. Okay, we weren't here, but we were in, I think, the other building. But it is one of the most impactful stories that I've heard in my life about remaining teachable. So I'm going to share it again. And so if it sounds familiar, just pretend you're hearing it for the first time. Okay. Okay. So when I was at North Park, and I know Pastor Rebecca knows this professor too, I'm going to call her Professor Michelle, initiated a restorative arts program through North Park Seminary, where inmates in Statesville Correctional Facility, which is a high security prison, would have the opportunity to obtain a master's level degree while incarcerated. And studies showed the impact that an educational program in prison would have on its inmates that would result in significant reduction in recidivism, or them being repeat offenders, and an improvement in relationships between staff prisoners and racial groups. So this restorative program focused on building empathy towards others, humility before God, and an appreciation for cultural perspectives. Professor Michelle and her team from North Park, which were essentially students, they would go into the prisons and they would teach behind bars. And some of them even were students taking classes in the prison behind bars. For the prisoners, many of them drew upon their life experiences of poverty and addiction and gang violence, racial discrimination, cultural differences, trauma, and crime, to find their voice and to find healing and redemption as they invited Christ into their world. On a rainy day, Professor Michelle entered the walls of Statesville, and she was wearing her raincoat to teach a class. It was a long, white, hooded coat. One of the inmates, William J., took one look at her and said, "Yeah, it's pretty risky wearing a white coat like that in here." Professor Michelle had no idea why he said that. And she filed it away, though, in her memory. Fast forward about 6 months, and the ECC has this Sankofa experience, they call it, and she was leading it. And what it is an interactive spiritual formation pilgrimage to better understand the civil rights movement by going back to famous sites of our Black brothers and sisters of the past and looking at how it is now with our present realities. So Professor Michelle talked about hearing from this one man named Anthony Ray Hinton on the Sankofa experience. And he was wrongfully convicted of 2 murders and remained on death row for 38 years until he was exonerated. It took 15 years for his case to be reviewed and another 15 years for the judge to hear it. Free at last, Anthony Ray Hinton had told Professor Michelle and others as it was raining, "When it rains, take off your hood on your raincoats and let the rain fall down upon you. They are God's tears of love crying down on you." And so they did that. And then they got to the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And there, Professor Michelle had to talk about the history and the significance of that bridge. And at the Edmund Pettus Bridge on March 7th, 1965, you probably all remember this, or not remember if you weren't here, but know about it. 600 civil rights marchers were attempting to cross the bridge to the Capitol in Montgomery when they were brutally attacked by armed police. And the attack was called Bloody Sunday. As Professor Michelle shared about who Edmund Pettus was, he was a white lawyer, a senator, a Confederate, and what history calls the Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan. It was as she heard these words uttered, Ku Klux Klan, that it hit her. Her memory went back to 6 months prior at Statesville to William J., the white hooded raincoat, and the words Ku Klux Klan. And she felt sick to her stomach. Sick as she felt, she had to keep on going about the bridge, and she later processed what she had said and how it affected William J. and possibly many other Black men that were in that prison. By wearing that white long coat with the hood at that time, she had stood in the place of the enemy. She, as a white person of privilege, never had to think or even thought about the clothes she wore or the racial terror revisited by these men of African American descent, seeing her walk into that prison wearing the white coat. She had never thought about the entitlement that we all carry with us having been raised differently and exposed to vastly different communities and histories. The next time she went to Statesville, she went to William J. to ask for forgiveness for what she had thoughtlessly done and the pain she had caused him. To which he simply responded, "Thank you, Professor. Not I accept your apology, not I forgive you, but simply thank you." And Professor Michelle had to accept that. I share this story that profoundly spoke to me about how we see or we don't see people and how we respond well to people, but as many other times, like Jesus in this scenario or Professor Michelle, there's a lapse of judgment with no ill will or motives. William J. taught Professor Michelle a valuable lesson. She had to become truthful in her humble process of what she had done as a teacher going into this prison, teaching them about God's mercy and justice. This posture of humility that Professor Michelle and the Canaanite woman had, whether from the wronged or the wrongdoer, can make all the difference in how teachable we remain and how successful we will emerge in contending for one another and learning from one another. Humility means being able to recognize and admit that we are all imperfect, broken, and we need Jesus. And we leave space for Jesus to come in and do more work in and with us when we remain teachable. Humility to listen deeply invites relationship. Number 3, it's about possibilities. It's about the possibilities. Ask questions to discover and understand and grow. The more Jesus listened to the woman, he came to understand that she actually had a prophetic grasp of what God's perspective of kingdom was supposed to be. A kingdom open to people from east and west. That's from Matthew 8:11 through 12. On the basis of their faith, not racial identity. This woman was not willing to accept the traditional Jewish exclusion of Gentiles. The theology of salvation doesn't preclude or prevent Jesus from exercising divine compassion or human faith. This is what we call Jesus loosening the laws, not breaking them or abandoning them, but expanding them where there's more so that Christ's love can be let in. How different the story would have been if Jesus didn't stop to respond to her, or if she didn't stand up for her faith. But because Jesus is about relationships and people, he has shown that he will always stand up for your faith and act in the name of mercy, justice, and compassion. For Jesus, it's about people and not protocol. And what about the disciples? What discoveries do you think they made as they watched? In the scenario, who were really the lost sheep of Israel that Jesus came for? The woman already saw herself as one in need. Can we say the same for the disciples, who were really the ones who needed to be taught about the power of humility and faith? As I think about Jesus' example about throwing food to the dogs before the children, I love that Jesus brought us an example around the table, around his table, where initially and traditionally only the masters were seated. But as reminded by this courageous woman, all should be welcome. Even the dogs have their place at the table in God's kingdom. This week there's several reflection questions, so please take a look at them. I've also listed several questions for you as you practice becoming better listeners and learners. Sometimes it's really hard to ask yourself these questions on the spot. I'd say to take a situation that maybe you come off of that has happened before, that you sense might have had a different outcome if you had been more open to being teachable, if you had asked yourself some hard, open-ended questions, or adopted a posture of humility to listen more deeply, to better understand each other or grow from the experience. One of the most recent and difficult experiences that I'm still trying to remain teachable with is the departure of Pastor Yumiko from our pastor team. And I've been reflecting a lot, knowing that this is the best way to grow and hopefully learn something about what maybe I did or didn't do, what I could do differently, if ever, in a similar situation. And it begins with asking Jesus, what is it that you want me to learn from this? What did you want me to see that I didn't? What did you want me to learn about in the process, Jesus? How could I and the rest of the leadership team have done better as leaders or for the church? And for me personally in friendship, what was my resistance and why? I'm still in process, and sometimes it takes a long time, and that's okay. What's important is that you be open to conversation and share deep listening with Jesus and trusted others. Remain teachable, and you will encounter the love of Christ. I'm going to end our time now by going back to Professor Michelle's story. Over a year had passed since she had seen William J. and asked for forgiveness for thoughtlessly wearing the white hooded raincoat into prison. It was Christmas season, and Professor Michelle was still going to the prison to pour herself into teaching the restorative arts degree program. But she reflects that her experience with William J. has transformed her in a way of how she was being and thinking and seeing herself and others as lost sheep who desperately need the mercy and grace of our Heavenly Father to remain teachable. On Christmas Eve afternoon, as she was leaving, as Professor Michelle walked through several successions of barred doors, she heard her name being called from down the hallway. "Professor Michelle!" It was William J. She answered, "Yes." "I have a Christmas present for you," he said. She was silent, that Jesus kind of silent. It's a good silence. And she was listening. William J. said to her, "I forgive you." And she said it was the best Christmas gift she could have ever gotten. Anyone can teach us if we let them reach us. Let's pray. Jesus, we submit ourselves to you, asking for more of you and your humbleness to listen better and deeply. More willingness to trust that as we remain open and teachable to anyone and everyone, we will encounter more of you and your love for us in powerful and precious ways. Help us to be willing to ask hard questions for the sake of discovering and growing and transforming into more of your likeness. We love you, Jesus, and it's in your name we pray. Amen.